Welcome all of you to, I think this is now the third in the series of lectures, Theology Alive, that Yale Center for Faith and Culture is putting up. We're exploring the issue of how our faith intersects with wide variety of disciplines, and we have called a number of practitioners and thinkers to help us think those issues through. And one of the things that they do for us is give this lecture. This is also part of a class, Theology Alive, where a group of students is studying the writings of all of our guests. And it's wonderful to have these conversations going on and to have such great lecturers present to us from these various angles and address the issue that moves, I think, all of us so much. And tonight we have a good friend of mine, Dorothy Bass, to deliver a lecture. She's a co-editor with me of at least one publication, and I've known Dorothy for quite some time, and it's a special pleasure that she would be here with us. To introduce her, I want to invite Sharon, who is Associate Director at the Center for Faith as a Way of Life project, which works with especially pastors and seeks to connect faith to daily life in work with them. So Chris, please come and welcome our guest.
Thank you. As I prepared some notes for this introduction, I was reflecting on when and where I first met Dorothy. And it turned out that when I first met her, one of the first things she did was introduce me to her husband, Mark Schwain, who shares a common passion with me in fly fishing in the Rocky Mountains. And this was at Holden Village in the North Cascades in Washington State. And that memory of being introduced to her husband, Mark, and hiking up into the mountain streams to fish brought to mind how important to me her practice of hospitality is, and her generosity in introducing me to all sorts of people, which has continued up to today. And so it's no small task to offer hospitality by way of this introduction to someone whose hospitality and introductions have been so kindly extended to me on many occasions. And it led me to reflect on how hospitality and the propensity to introduce people is a hallmark also of her academic career. She's a graduate of Wellesley College and Union Theological Seminary in New York City and Brown University, and she's taught at several colleges and theological schools, including Chicago Theological Seminary and Valparaiso University. And as a church historian, she's contributed many articles in scholarly journals and chapters in edited volumes, including writing a wonderful book titled Receiving the Day on the practice of Sabbath keeping in contemporary society. I brought visual aids for the books that she's written, and many of you I know have read this book. Yet she's likely best known for the works that have come from a savvy combination of intellectual giftedness and her knack for inviting and introducing and hosting scholarly conversations that aim to speak to the broader public. And it's these books and this work that most markedly underlines the reasons for her invitation to participate in this series. Through this combination of gifts, I would argue she has been powerfully effective in doing what so many scholars wish to do, but struggle to do, which is to take profound ideas and reach a broad public in such a way that the ideas change lives. For shorthand, we at the Center for Faith and Culture call this giving ideas legs. Dorothy has done this, given ideas legs, through the work of gathering authors, fostering conversations, and from those conversations, editing or co-editing such well-received books as Practicing Our Faith, A Way of Life for a Searching People, and with our own Miroslav Volf, which he mentioned, Practicing Theology, Beliefs and Practices in the Christian Life. And then very interesting volume, Way to Live, Christian Practices for Teens, that was written by adults and teenage partners, each chapter. So they were written after a process of conversations across generations, and especially with a young audience in mind. While working on these book projects, she has served as the director of the Valparaiso Project on the Education and Formation of People of Faith, which is a Lilly Endowment project based at Valparaiso University. The project's mission is to sponsor a series of books such as this and conferences connected to the books with the aim of developing theological, historical, and practical resources that contribute to the authenticity and the vitality of contemporary efforts in Christian education and formation. This project now offers multiple kinds of mini-grants to churches and all kinds of other organizations that wish to try innovative projects to embody these practices in their communities, in their organizations. And they've developed a very creative website which both highlights all kinds of resources for these kinds of churches and organizations who wish to draw on these practices, and offers examples of these projects that have received grants, and the grants have run their course, and then they've reported about what they've accomplished in their time working on their particular project. So you can see that she's both a scholar and a practitioner of these arts of living the Christian life. And so because of that, especially that wonderful combination, it's with delight and anticipation that I invite you to join me in welcoming Dorothy Bass.
Thank you very much, Chris. It's a real joy to be here. I'm always kind of humbled when introduced in such a warm way and received so warmly into this community as I already have been this afternoon, because I'm so aware of how I'm just one representative of really a very big collaborative body of work. I mean, collaboration undergirds everything that I do and all that I've published in this project. And I came into this work at the invitation of Craig Dykstra, a practical theologian who had a vision about how we could help people to grow in Christian life by lifting up practices. And then it's been my privilege to invite other people into that work, which it's really been a joy to be able to do that, and that will be continuing. So I feel like I stand here sort of by myself, but not really. It's also always a joy to be invited into places of collaboration. I mean, I got a glimpse of a classroom at work today and of a project on faith in the workplace, which are places of collaboration that you also foster. Even more than these, in these specific networks, a model of or a desire for collaboration, a desire to guide contemporary people into forms of collaboration on behalf of the well-being of the world undergirds all of our work. Part of our hypothesis, I think, in this project is that we all know there's a contemporary spiritual quest going on, right? There's a search of some kind going on amidst the many changes of our time. Some people say this is for meaning, and it probably is in part. Suppose in a large sense it is for God. Part of our hypothesis and part of what we're building on in this collaborative work is the idea that what people are also yearning for is a way of life that adds up to something in the midst of the fragmentation and the multiple poles that we experience as contemporary people in an advanced society like this one. We long for a way of life that is, should we say, good in a deep sense, good for ourselves. We sometimes wonder if how we're living is good for ourselves, good for others, those near at hand, our children, and also those afar, those who stitch our clothing, those who, the many, good for others, good for creation, which is in travail, and good really because attuned to that which is good, to God. In a sense, what we've been doing in our work on Christian practices is just trying to describe such a way of life, one practice at a time. You know, I say you can't describe a whole way of life all at once. And so we've been taking chunks or streams within that way of life. How do we live in time? How do we welcome strangers? How do we help one another to die well? Been looking at a way of life one piece at a time. The term practices is used in many ways in ordinary language and probably in even more ways in the contemporary academy. And it finds a place in many different, sometimes even opposing theoretical contexts. In all of these contexts, however, the term points at the least to the social character of human thought and action, to the fact that each human being exists with and among specific other human beings whose patterns of language and feeling and action and imagination and thought are profoundly formative. Contemporary U.S. Christians typically now belong to numerous social groups, okay? Belong to numerous communities of practice whose practices overlap or conflict or converge or seem to run on parallel tracks. And one of the simplest yet most pervasive moves my companions and I have been making is to urge contemporary U.S. Christians to take seriously the wisdom born by one of these social groups, one that they claim to be at the heart of their identity, born by the particular society composed of persons of faith. In doing so, we speak, first of all, to persons of Christian faith in our books. But our purpose is much wider because we believe that faithful, critical, and constructive engagement in Christian practices is undertaken in the midst of the world, for the sake of the world, and, if faithful, will redound to the well-being of the world. About 2 years ago, there was a conference here shortly after the book that Miroslav and I edited together was published. And the theologian David Ford did us the great honor of reading closely what we had said, and in a few brief sentences summarized that better than I probably could do. So I'm going to just read you one paragraph of his comment on our work as a way of introducing some of what this is about. He said, "At the heart of the book is a vision of God and of life in line with the purposes of God. This is described as a way of life abundant not in things but in love, justice, and mercy, lived out through practices such as honoring the body, hospitality, household economics." This is actually the chapter list of practicing our faith. Saying yes and saying no, keeping Sabbath, testimony, discernment, shaping communities, forgiveness, healing, dying well, and singing our lives. All of these are social practices belonging to groups of people across generations, practices big enough, rich enough, and complex enough to address some fundamental feature of human existence. I like this phrase, immersed in history and culture, but not assimilated to them, resisting the separation of thought from action, shaped through an understanding that emerges in the whole community over time as it carries on negotiations of meaning at dinner tables and in congregations, hospitals, businesses, schools, and countless other places, imbued with the knowledge of God and creation, dependent on grace, and rooted in baptism as the liturgical consummation of all the Christian practices. He goes on to say that he would think of this as a wisdom theology, arising from a transgenerational community that understands itself as living in relation to God. Now, before I became a student and teacher of Christian practices, I was a student and teacher of the history of Christianity. I remember from my earliest youth being profoundly moved by a sense of the communion of saints. And I remember in confirmation class hearing that term and thinking, wow. And by awareness of the great cloud of witnesses. Wow. By the awesome longevity of the Bible and the Lord's Supper and those who had treasured these before me. During the 1980s, I served as the only historian on the faculty of a small, shall I say, understaffed, and quite theologically liberal theological seminary of the United Church of Christ. Most of our students did not come to their studies with a conscious hunger to plumb the riches of the Christian past, though they were quite aware of the shortcomings of that past, okay? And assumed that all that could be found in the past was restrictive and to be overcome. Or, in putting it another way, often we're simply much more interested in matters that were more obviously urgent, contemporary, and practical. Over time, serving in that station, I discerned a vocation of helping these students to see the richness of historic Christianity, so that they might own their own calling to bear that rich heritage in new ways, as well as old ways, into an uncertain future. And I take this heritage to be a far more capacious one than most people understand, far more internally diverse, far encompassing many cultures and denominational traditions, and that this capacious tradition that is ours is full of riches. This conviction undergirds the very ecumenical character of the project. And my ecumenical rule is that I'm interested in working with Protestants, Catholics, mainly Protestants, Roman Catholics, evangelicals, who are interested in working with each other. You know, there's some in each one of those parties who aren't interested in working with members of the others, but those who are open to working with one another, I love working with all of those and seek that kind of representation in our projects. Well, during that period of time when I was a teacher of history of Christianity in this urban context, there was one image hanging on my office wall, which to me represented the shared faith of Christian people across the centuries. And it was the painting, or I suppose it's a lithograph or something, by John August Swanson, Festival of Lights, which is now on the cover of Practicing Our Faith. However, this is not on the cover of Practicing Our Faith because it had been on my wall. To the contrary, I knew that I had found a new vocation beyond the one I had expected to shape all the rest of my days. When we had sent in the manuscript and the publisher found this image somewhere and wrote me an ardent letter, please, Dorothy, accept this cover, please accept this cover, and sent it to me in a Federal Express overnight mailer, with this ardent little message. And I pulled it out, and there was the picture right in front of me, and I really laughed. And it still speaks to me, it's still in my office, and it still speaks to me of this transgenerational, historic, and I want to say, in a tradition, I'll get into this more later, a tradition has a future as well as a past. That's where we come in. Okay? So I should also say that the book, if some of you know Practicing Our Faith, which is used in quite a few congregations, and also in good many contextual education classes in theological schools. This was written. Almost everyone in here was a theological educator, doctorate in some field of theology, range of denominations, and so on. And we wrote this book. We thought it was pretty good. We're writing for a broad public. And then we decided that each one of us would invite a friend who we took to be in one of the groups that we hoped would read and profit from this book. And they read it. And so there are 13 people here, so the 26 of us sat down together. And we learned that we had a lot more rewriting to do. I selected as my friend Susan Briel, who was Chris's campus pastor and who was director at that time of Holden Village, which he mentioned. And others selected people in, pastors and religious journalists, religious educators, and so on. It was really a very exciting thing. And And I've come to think that friendship is one of the great motive forces in good theological writing, an important factor. Okay. Now, I think that a strong historical element continues to infuse project publications, not in a systematic or guild-oriented type way, but I think we draw fairly heavily on history as a resource in, should we say, stretching the imagination about what can be possible for people of faith. This also has the salutary effect of demonstrating that our own accustomed and treasured ways of doing things are not set in stone, and that there has been change, there will be change. So there's a stimulating the imagination quality to our historical perspective, as well as a kind of dislodging the certainties of the present. However, I'm fully aware of the need to appropriate critically. We never say that that things can be pulled whole out of the past. But most importantly, I do not believe, no, I'm quite certain in every way that we can manage that there is not a narrative of decline implicit in our understanding of the place of the current church in history. Okay, the project has published one volume of historical essays by really first-rate scholars. It was edited by the medievalist John Van Engen of the University of Notre Dame, and it included Jewish scholars writing about Judaism as well as history of Christianity, looking at education and formation through practices, Jewish practices and Christian practices in the pre-modern era. But even there, the conviction of the authors was there have always been challenges to authentic and vital religious observance and Christian faith. Okay, there have always been challenges, and we need to be aware of that. So, one of the more helpful, my favorite books on a Christian practice was not sponsored by my project, though it's become a partner now, as Christine Pohl's book, Making Room, Recovering Hospitality as a Christian Practice. Christine is a Christian ethicist, and she writes a history, and some of you in the class have probably read a synopsis of this in the article you said was handed out from Christian Century. But Christine is interested in recovering hospitality, and she means hospitality to those who are poor and who are strangers. Okay, and she does a history of that, which we can see as a continuous practice in Judaism and Christianity of hospitality to strangers. But noting that in the early church, the home was a more public place, okay, and was more coincidental with the church, and was a place in which strangers could be, should we say, safely and helpfully received. Then we get a rise of big institutions, and the face-to-face quality of hospitality is lost. As larger institutions, monasteries, but there is still an ongoing debate. What does it mean? What do we owe to strangers? Which strangers? How long? Okay. And then into the 20th century, when there was a recovery of face-to-face hospitality, really through the invention of new institutions such as Catholic worker houses, and the private home of the late 20th century, she says, can't receive strangers in the same way that the early Christian home could do. And so we see a historical retrieval of a language which was in danger of being lost to Martha Stewart, okay? And a sense that we need to be creative in our own efforts to practice something which is undeniably important within our faith tradition, which is our need to greet strangers and those in need with hospitality, not with hostility. Okay, and I have seen Christine in a room full of people who work in their congregation's feeding ministries, quoting Chrysostom to them, and helping them resolve issues around how to set the tables and what kind of engagement to have between hosts and guests with reference to the Christian past. Okay. I don't know if this historical orientation is immediately obvious to the project's largely lay, largely Protestant audience. But I think this kind of grounding is salutary in ways that go beyond the resources gained in a time of change when, in a culture that really prizes the new. Traditions are there whether people realize it or not. And continuity is not the same as captivity. Caring for a living tradition includes adaptivity and inventiveness within ever-changing circumstances. Let me see. I was going to explain what practices are, but I'm going to say that David Ford has done that. Let me move on a little bit further. One of the terms that I like to think about as when I think about the practices we understand them, is embodied wisdom. Now there are many people in the contemporary religious arena talking about spiritual practices. I think that, and we think those are important in many ways. I think the emphasis of our work, however, has been on the embodied relationships of material life, of people, how do they live together, and looking at everyday life. Okay? So I want to leave plenty of time for conversation with you. Part of our claim is that wisdom about the shape of fundamental human needs and ways of addressing them is embedded in historic Christian practices that can become a profound resource for contemporary people who seek to sustain a measure of freedom within a prevailing economic culture, where needs for specific, often branded material products seem to multiply as global markets expand. Being able to tell the difference between fundamental human needs and manufactured ones can mean the difference between lives that are grasping and lives that are in a deep sense free. For most North Americans, for example, this can mean the difference between being driven by market-induced desires and demands and being free to share possessions and to keep Sabbath. I think some of you have read Receiving the Day in the class, which is my own book. The subtitle is Christian Practices for Opening the Gift of Time. It's the only one I've written all by myself in this corpus of literature. When the 13 of us who wrote Practicing Our Faith were going to write a book about this way of life that was shaped by Christian practices, we had to determine which practices, what we would call practices and which ones we would include. And it was pretty clear from the beginning that one of the historic practices that was an important part of a faithful way of life was one we were calling keeping Sabbath. And at the time that we were deciding what to include, then we had this little process where we got to nominate each other to write on the specific ones. And I was willing to arm wrestle for the right, to fight, to go to the mat for the right to write about keeping Sabbath. Because I was at the time a seminary professor with 7-year-old twins. It was kind of crazy. My husband was it was nuts. And I really knew that there was some help there for me. In fact, I'd been aware that there was some help there for me for a few years. And I really wanted to research that. Whenever we treat a practice, we would look at its We did social scientific research on some of the frameworks that was influencing that practice. So I read about sleep deprivation and work hours and things like that. We did a history of the practice and times when it had been retrieved and times when it had been distorted. I think that there have been times historically that Sabbath has become a burden rather than a gift in some communities. When it's all law and no grace, it can become a bludgeon from the dominant group over against others who do not have this, who worship at a different time. Okay, and that's been an important part of American constitutional law. Also to investigate it theologically. And as I did this, I came to the conclusion, developed a theology of Sabbath, which was grounded in the commandments and then moved towards a Christian appropriation of what was, first of all, a Jewish practice. And I wanted thoroughly to honor the definitive, enduring covenant of Sabbath, which Jewish people still observe. And came up with a theology of Sabbath grounded in a theology of creation. You know, one reason we keep Sabbath is that God created the heaven and earth and then took a day off and blessed and sanctified that day. A theology of liberation. Another reason we keep Sabbath, according to the commandment in Deuteronomy, is because God led, when we do so, we remember that God led the people out of slavery with a mighty hand. And then also a theology of resurrection. This is a day which now, as the Christian people over time have conjoined Sabbath and the Lord's Day, the day of resurrection. It's also now a day of proclaiming and experiencing the new life of Christ's victory over death, a day of new creation. So I did that, and Practicing Our Faith was published. And that essay was published in Christian Century and Christianity Today. And there was a lot of interest in this topic. I understand you've been talking about that all week with some other authors as well. But so many people asked, does it have to be only on Sunday? I can't keep Sabbath on Sunday. And I came to think that actually the Christian tradition has a great deal of wisdom about time that goes beyond that one day. There's a lot of other wisdom about time as well. To be slightly hokey here, about this time my little girl was at the age of 4, I think, said, "What time is it, Mommy?" You know, what time is it? Well, it's 7 o'clock in the morning. No. I suggested it's breakfast time. No. It's time for Sesame Street. No. She said, Halloween all finished? Christmas all finished? Valentine's all finished? What time is it? Okay? So how we move through time is really important in identity. Okay? You might miss something if you don't know what time it is. And that's true in a very large sense as well as in a small cultural one. We overlook our mortality, for example. And the idea that over the centuries, Christian people and Jews before and still have been thinking about that question. What time is it? You know, and have been offering responses to that question, which they live out in patterns of life and also discuss in books and words. Okay, so there's a joint living out of a response. So in receiving the day, I did consider Sabbath. I just came to think biblically and theologically that Sabbath does mean a day, one day out of 7. But also then looked at Christian wisdom about the shape of each day and how do we receive each day with attentiveness and gratitude. Okay? And then also looked at the liturgical year. How do we, what is the shape of the year? How does it form us in faith? What does it teach us about time? And it teaches us some things about time, including about by drawing us into the Christian story, and teaches us about our mortality, I think, and new life. So this is an example of how this unpacking of wisdom for our contemporary period is based. You had so much good to say in the break that I'm going to truncate a little bit and try to allow you to do that. Let me put it all together and say that I think what we've been trying to develop is a way of thinking about our way of life. Okay? A way of thinking about our way of life, an invitation to people, with the help of some resources, to enter into conversation with one another in context about their way of life. So that when people know that their lives are out of control in terms of time, they'll say, okay, right now start keeping a full day Sabbath and observing all the seasons. I would be much more likely to say, what is the one thing that you can do within your context that would take you a step further into the practice? I would also be likely to say, you are already started on this practice. I don't need to condemn you and say that you're not anywhere on this. If if you're sleeping at all, you're already started. You know the importance of rest. You show up at least for that morning at church. You show up for a little while at church. That's a start. And what's the next thing we can do to expand our participation in that practice? Okay, what's the next thing we can do? Now, the way of thinking about the life of Christian faith that we're proposing is a way of thinking that is really still in process. When Miroslav and I convened a group to work on beliefs and practices, those people were systematic theologians whom we invited into this conversation because we were aware that doctrine was not being adequately addressed. Craig Dykstra and I were aware and wanted to expand that part of the way of thinking. We're now working with practical theology, practical theologians to try to expand this way of thinking. So it's very much in process, but it's not as much in process as the way of life, and figuring that all out is. When I wrote Receiving the Day, I start off with an image of the date books that all the children in my town were required to have. Remember that? Well, those children may still have date books, but nowadays you'd have to talk about Palm Pilots. It's only 5 years, okay? And the pace of life is still changing. So some of the proposals that I made at that time are almost out of date already. Okay? There's more technology coming. There's more demand. Global markets are keeping people awake at all hours, even more than they were then. I spoke at a Presbyterian church in Chicago, and someone who was a commodities broker said, I can hardly protect Christmas. It's just really hard to protect any time whatsoever. All time is up for grabs in the demands of the market that I'm involved in. Email and Receiving the Day and giving ideas for people to live more gratefully and graciously in time. I say, I don't do email at home. Well, that was 5 years ago. And I still renew that commitment again every month or two. But it's very hard. It's very hard. And so I do renew that commitment every month or two. And I don't do email on Sundays. But it's hard. Okay, so this is all still in flux. When we did Way to Live, my kids and I, who were then in high school, worked on the chapter on time in the life of high school students. And this brought me to a whole new understanding of the demands on time that people in our culture experience. I mean, the poor kids they live to bells all the day long, and then they're sent out into a society that wants to either they're cast aside and put in front of a video screen, or somebody's trying to keep them busy every moment so they don't get in trouble. Okay? I mean, these the main options I see for teenagers in time. So new research, new perspectives keep coming in, and I continue to think about this practice and how can be crafted. I think this is a very good term. How can be crafted to the context of real life in our time. Okay? In the midst of all this, I think that a kind of a distinctive rhetoric has come into view. We didn't really, I don't know how much we planned it, but there is a rhetoric here. Allison kind of summed it up very nicely this afternoon when we were talking. We've tried to come to an accessible and generous voice. We do believe that the tradition bears wisdom, worth sharing, but we try always to embody modesty in making that offer and to be aware of our own failures to completely live up to whatever we think is inherent in a Christian practice. So that's one feature of there's a certain modesty, I think, a certain accessibility and a generosity. Often we begin with perceived human need and move towards how the tradition can be helpful, how practice can be helpful in addressing that need. So that my own frazzled life was a beginning point for reaching out to others and offering to them the help of the Christian practices for opening the gift of time. Sometimes this means that it sounds a little bit too much like a middle-class white woman, when I'm writing or whatever, and I use the term "we" fairly freely in a literary hope of drawing people into the narrative. And I'm aware that sometimes that can be criticized because I'm not speaking for every "we." I use that I speak of I if I'm speaking about me, but if I'm describing the human condition, we are mortal, we are this, we are that, in order to draw people in, and sometimes that is criticized. On the other, and I'm aware of that, I think it's effective in a literary and rhetorical sense, but I do always look at what we've written and what I've written and ask, will this stand in a world of poverty? Will this, I can't write from the perspective of those who are poor, but will this stand? Is it laughable? Am I taking it too much for granted that people can take off time or whatever? Okay, so that's the corrective and it's a matter of discernment. Another thing is, I think we often take, shall we say, the high road or a more positive path and try to offer ways of building up, constructing a way of life that is good, as opposed to saying, here's what's wrong, and here's all the bad stuff. Okay, for example, in Way to Live, we say early on, this book does not contain a lot of do's and don'ts. That's not what we think the Christian life is primarily about. There are plenty of people telling you not to cheat, not to take drugs, not to have sex too soon, and we agree with that. We don't think people should cheat. We don't think you should use drugs. But we're not going to really be talking about that. We're going to be talking about how satisfying and fulfilling and authentic and honest and healthy way of life that honors the body, that honors truth-telling can be. Is we take the high road in a sense, and it may just be I don't like conflict that much, but it does seem to me that in a time in society when many church arguments and discussions, I get involved in them along with everyone else, but in our work we try to lift up, in a sense, the prior work of honoring the body, the prior work of building up truthfulness, rather than getting involved in specific church arguments. Okay. I try to offer these practices as gifts rather than as law. This may be my now newfound Lutheranism that's coming out, but as it's evident throughout the language that we try not to make these demands, and I'm not even likely to use the language of law and obedience I don't use very frequently, although I do think there's a real place for it, and it might come near the end of a book. I think also that our rhetoric seeks to focus conversation about faith and life by addressing specific persons and situations as much as possible. So, in fact, the authors of Practicing Our Faith, as we were trying to gear ourselves up to write in a more accessible way, used the term homiletical for what we were trying to do. There's a certain rhetoric of persuasion that is similar to a sermon, though not quite the same. And I don't use that so much in my own work. For example, when I was getting ready to write the chapter on keeping Sabbath and practicing our faith, one of my friends sent me an email. The Sabbath commandment was in the lectionary of the ELCA. Their pastor had gotten up and said, well, we're going to have a short sermon today because we have a business meeting after church. It was a very contentious meeting. It was, all he said about the Sabbath commandment was it means you should go to church every Sunday. So I really directed my chapter to persuading congregations not to have business meetings on Sunday after church. I mean, in a sense, all kinds of stuff is there, but this was my rhetorical focus. Similarly, my civic-minded Presbyterian parents, when I was writing about the liturgical year, I was really trying to explain to them why I am so gaga over the liturgical year. Really trying to persuade those people. I often have someone in mind when I'm writing. In the midst of this rhetoric, I think a way of being religious in public is coming into view. Sometimes one image, my colleagues and I think of ourselves as standing by the church door, explaining to people in the town square, and hoping that the ones inside will also listen. What we're doing in there, why we're there, what's going on. Okay? Why do we gather on Sundays? Why do we offer our money? Why do we do those things, and what implications does that have for the rest of life? Secondly, another image. I think that each one of these practices shows up in our personal lives, in congregational life, in family life, in public life, and so on. So, for example, hospitality is a movement of the inner person. It's a matter of personal relationship. It takes place in the home. It takes place in the congregation. It is figured liturgically. And it's a matter of public policy. So in making those connections, we're trying to conjoin realms which often get fragmented one from another. A third image of what we're doing, I hope that there's that our humility about our own journey makes it clear that I think we rarely speak with real hostility towards those beyond the church. But that we feel that our faith has made a difference because we are immersed in history and culture but not assimilated to them, as David Ford said. That we have an expanded range of companions near at hand, globally and historically. That we are renewing the language that people can use to talk about their lives in a certain way. A rich sense of Sabbath, of hospitality. These are words that are being ripped off and marketed in certain ways. And that our imagination has been altered. Fourth, I think that one part, that if you add this up and ask how it looks in the culture, we'd be talking more about salt and yeast, we'd be talking about subversion, we'd be talking about resistance, as opposed to a thoroughly and consistently over-againstness. Okay? Because we're very aware that the practices in which we engage are melded into and overlap with, and sometimes helpfully and sometimes not, the other practices in which we live as members of society and as historical beings. I have more, but I think that's where I should stop, and I really would value your comments and what you are seeing and hearing in all of this. So, sure.